Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer portion. At that time, you can ask a question by pressing star 1 on your touch-tone phone. This conference is being recorded, so if you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'd now like to hand over to Mr. Mark Patterson.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to thank Shane and AASHTO for their help in coordinating these calls. As some of you have seen since our first call we had in February, and if you were here in D.C. and heard the administrator speak last week, then you know that as going forward in this next year, we're kind of revamping the calls, and we're going to have them once a month, and we're going to have topics that are of value and targeted to specific audiences. So today is our first attempt at doing that, and we're going to have a presentation today on Grantee Reporting. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John Winkle, who's going to lead that. And then also at the end, we will have Q&A, so please just hold any questions to the end. And those questions, when you ask them, please make them, if they're specific to your project or something that's unique to you, use your regional manager or your the email address that we have that you'll see in a moment to make those questions. And today we'd like to concentrate on questions that may have a broad audience and appeal to a lot of people. Thanks very much, and here's John Winkle.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. As Mark mentioned, my name is John Winkle, and I am a grant manager here at FRA. Thank you for participating. I hope you find this helpful. Looking at a list of our grantees, I see some of my grantees out there, so welcome to you guys too. Next. Here's the agenda. I will be handling the majority of the discussion, and Alice Alexander, who is another one of our grant managers here at FRA, will be handling a portion of the discussion. She will be addressing the ARA 1512 reports and the final performance reports. This is intended to be a very broad, general discussion of the reports that are required for all of FRA's grantees. Specific issues are best addressed through your individual grant managers and also through the general FRA grant email inbox, which is fra-grants@dot.gov. Don't worry if you did not get that down. We will repeat it again at the end of the presentation in the Grantee Resources section. This presentation is intended to help grantees understand the importance of responsible reporting and learn more about some of the key required reports. Just a brief overview of the agenda. We'll be giving an introduction to reporting and discussing why reporting matters, an overview of the required reports, reporting due dates, things like that. Next, there'll be a discussion of the required reports, both those that are required of all of our grantees, the FRA Quarterly Progress Report and the Standard Form 425 Financial Report, as well as reports that are due for ARA and Tiger grantees. We'll then have a wrap-up, and the last discussion will be a brief discussion of the reporting resources that are available to our grantees. And as Mark mentioned, there will be a question and answer session at the end, but again, hold all your questions until then, and we would like only broad questions that apply to only all or a significant number of our grantees. Individual questions about specific grants or projects are better addressed through your individual grant managers or through the FRA General Grant Email Inquiry inbox. Introduction to reporting. Why reporting matters. Federal grant reporting is required of everyone who receives funds under, anybody who receives federal grant funds. It is a critical component of federal grants management. It validates that projects are on track with scope, schedule, and budget, and it provides opportunities for FRA to assist projects that are off track or require assistance. It is part of FRA's overall monitoring and oversight mission. Some of the reports are used just for FRA's purposes, the progress report and the SF 425. However, other reports are used by us and other federal government agencies to develop accurate budgets, inform congressional, GAO, and OIG inquiries. Federal reports or the grant reports are a key communication used to capture the grant story. And this is especially true after grants have been around for 6 months or a year or more, and we have the opportunity to track progress and see how things are going, see if challenges have been overcome. It allows grantees to formally document project progress, achievements, setbacks, and expenses to those of us here at FRA. And this is especially critical, for example, if we have limited travel budgets and are not able to visit projects frequently. It provides us a snapshot of progress, and as I said, over time, as we receive more and more reports, it gives us a good idea of the overall story of the grant. Now, there are consequences for inaccurate or late reporting. The most common is that reimbursement requests may be denied or delayed. For example, if I receive a reimbursement request from a grantee, I will make sure that all reporting is up to date and accurate. If it's not, then that could delay, or as I said, I will end up denying the reimbursement request until all required reports are submitted. Inaccurate or late reporting could also subject grantees to increased monitoring activity. FRA is in the process of rolling out a robust monitoring program. We have just started the initial steps of that. Some of our grantees have already experienced monitoring visits, and we will be accelerating that and increasing the scope as we go on. So inaccurate or late reports will possibly subject you to increased monitoring activities. Also, a federal grantee who has problem reporting would be less likely to be considered for future potential funding opportunities. And ultimately, federal grantees who do not report may be reported for noncompliance. And this is especially critical for the ARA and TIGER grantees because, as I mentioned, some of those reports go to agencies other than FRA, and they have consequences for not submitting the required reports. Reporting requirements in the grant lifecycle. Obviously, reports are not required until the award obligation. So the majority of grantee reports are submitted between the award obligation and the grant closeout stages of the grant lifecycle. It is the grantor's responsibility to review the entire NGA in order to identify the reporting requirements for the grant. It's in fact the grantee's responsibility to review the NGA for all applicable provisions in the NGA, but it is especially important for reporting requirements. All of the reporting requirements will be listed in the NGA, whether it's a standard FRA grant or whether it is an ARA or a TIGER grant. Also on this slide, we see an overview of the reporting responsibilities in the grant lifecycle. As you'll see at the beginning, the first three stages are grayed out. There's no requirement for reporting there until a grantee has actually been awarded a grant. At the award obligation stage, it is imperative, as I mentioned before, for the new grantee to review the NGA to identify reporting requirements. I have grantees who have found it helpful to create a schedule based on identified reporting requirements and project start and end dates. And that way you can notify essentially yourself that required reports are due. Post-award management, simple. Submit the reports based on requirements and schedule, whether it's just the standard FRA reports or whether it's the ARA or TIGER grants that require additional reports. And I'll go through, I believe on the next slide or pretty soon thereafter, the reporting deadlines for the various reports. And then at grant closeout, all of our grants require a final performance report, which is basically a summary of progress under the grant, as well as a final financial status report that shows complete funding of the grant. An overview of the required reports. The FRA Standard Progress Report and the SF 425 Financial Report are due of all of our grantees. The Final Performance Report is also due from all of our grantees. Additional reports may be required based on the type of grant. For example, the ARA 1512 Jobs Report, which is very important. The ARA grantees out there are aware of this. And then the TIGER grants also require their own individual reports. The FRA Quarterly Progress Report is a narrative report, and in my opinion, it's the best chance for the grantee to tell the story of the grant, because it's not just numbers, it's actual descriptions, it's actual written description of progress, problems, and accomplishments expected in the near future. The SF 425 is a standard form used by many government agencies. I think some tailor it to their individual needs, but FRA's is fairly standard. And the Final Performance Report is, again, more of a narrative report that allows the grantee to expand upon the accomplishments achieved under the grant. That's not due until all funds are spent down or the grant is or the project is completed. The final type of report that I want to call your attention to is the FAFATA reporting for subawards. FAFATA reporting is more complicated than FRA's regular report. OMB has issued a couple of memorandums discussing FAFATA reporting. All of the FAFATA reporting information, including links to those OMB memos, are on our website. And again, at the end of the discussion, we will have a slide that shows all of the applicable websites for the resources. If you have individual questions about FAFATA reporting, I recommend that you contact your individual grantee or individual grant manager, or submit a message to FRA's general inbox. One thing I will note about the FAFATA reporting is that it is not required for ARA recipients, because a lot of the information that is reported on the FAFATA report, or required for the FAFATA report, is also required for the 1512 report, so it's a little bit duplicative. Here you'll see a sample page from one of our standard NGAs. This page discusses the progress or the reports that are due for all federal grantees, whether they're ARA, TIGER, or one of our other programs. You'll see Section 9 is the discussion of the progress report. Section 10 discusses the quarterly federal financial report, the SF-425, and Section 11 discusses the interim and or final reports. Final reports are required. An interim report would only be required if it was part of the scope of work. So if there are grants out there that have an interim report in the scope of work, then it would be due in accordance with the scope of work language. Otherwise, we don't need an interim report, just the final report. Some of our other grants, for example, the ARA grant has a separate section of ARA clauses that includes the required ARA reporting. And then the TIGER grants also have their own individual type of reports, including things like performance measures. I want to reemphasize again that when reviewing your NGA, go to this section, make sure you understand all the reports. Any questions, please ask us. And also, I want to distinguish the reporting requirements in the NGA from the deliverables that are in the scope of work. Deliverables are also required, but they're not standard. They're individual based on the project, the type of project. And all of our grantees are expected to be familiar with the deliverables and expect to deliver them in a timely manner. All the reports are due quarterly, although on different dates. The FRA Quarterly Progress Report and the Standard Form 425 are due at the end of the month following the last month of the quarter. So we are in March right now, which is the second quarter for federal reporting. At the end of March, the reports for January, February, and March will be due April 30th. The TIGER Progress Report, which is a report particular to TIGER grants, is due the 20th of each month following the end of the previous quarter. And the ARA 1512 report is due the 10th of the month, although the 1512 report is a little bit different because once the ARA report, the day for ARA report closes, there is time for some back and forth and corrections between FRA and the grantee. Alice will go over this in more detail when she discussed the 1512 reports. I want to emphasize here that quarterly reports are due even if the grant was signed late in the quarter. So if you have a grant that was signed September 28th, we still need a report for the fourth quarter. Even if it says you have done nothing and spent nothing, we still need a report showing that you have done and spent nothing. And one other highlight I want to point out, for ARA recipients only, the deadline for dispersing ARA funds is September 30th, 2017. Any funds not dispersed on that date will be de-obligated if already obligated, or taken back if not obligated. For ARA recipients, all required documentation must be submitted by July 31st, 2017 to allow sufficient time for completion of closeout and reimbursement no later than this September 30th deadline. So I know that seems like a long time away, but time flies. Something I've learned even more so since I've had a kid. And decisions and things that happen now in 2012 or 2013 can impact project schedules for a couple of years out. So we are asking all of our grantees to pay close attention to this deadline, make sure that you are proceeding on budget or on schedule, and if there are any problems, you bring them to our attention as quickly as possible, because we obviously want to see all those funds spent and we want to see those projects completed. Required reports. The first report is the FRA Quarterly Progress Report, and Alice knows as well as I do that these have been around for a long, long time, virtually unchanged. So I personally find the Quarterly Progress Report the most helpful for reviewing progress for grants, reviewing reimbursement requests. As I mentioned earlier, it really allows the grantee to explain what they've done with the project, how they are working in accordance with the scope of work, the progress they're making in accordance with the scope of work, any problems or challenges that have arisen, and the anticipated progress in the next quarter. I'm just going to go through the Quarterly Progress Report quickly, field by field. I want to point out in the upper left-hand corner of our slide, this is required of all grantees. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the due date is 30 days after the end of each quarter. And please submit to your individual grant manager via email. We will take them by regular mail, but it is much easier to distribute by email. And please include the grant number in the subject line. That also makes it easier for us to distribute. We also take these reports and upload them into Grant Solutions as part of the overall grant file. And that makes electronic copies and grant numbers in email subject lines that much more. It makes it much easier to do that if we have those things. The upper left-hand corner of the Quarterly Progress Report is just basic descriptions. It has grant numbers, project name, the grantee manager, and the FRA manager. There is a line there for WBS number. I don't know what that is. I don't know if Alice knows, but perhaps it's a holdover from previous forms. Just leave that blank. The performance progress portion of the standard progress report shows is the place where the grantee will list the period ending. So if it ends December 31st, and then the start and end date of the project. And the header also includes financial progress, a brief field for financial progress that shows the amount that was obligated for grants, the amount that has been expended, and the amount remaining. But the 425 is really the form where we more closely track expenditures under the grant. But the progress report provides an opportunity to give a brief snapshot of that. The project description field summarizes the core components of the project, and it provides an overview of goals and objectives during the current quarter. It is basically a summary of the project description in the scope of work. That helps us separate one project from another because I know Alice and I both have large workloads, and a lot of projects tend to blend together. So we like to see a good project description so that when we see a report, we know exactly which project we're dealing with. The next field, significant accomplishments this period. And this is really helpful for us when we are reviewing invoices. The more information we have here, the easier it is for us to make a decision whether or not a submitted invoice, whether or not the expenses submitted along with an invoice are justifiable. So we're not expecting War and Peace. We're not expecting a huge amount of information here, but a good paragraph summarizing what was done in the previous quarter is very, very helpful for us. Makes our jobs much easier, and usually means we don't have to go back and forth with the grantee to discuss progress when a reimbursement request comes due. The next section of the reports, next two sections of the reports are tables. One of them lists project progress, and the other one lists cumulative financial trends. These are both very helpful for us because they provide in a snapshot progress against the scope of work and against the individual task elements in the scope of work. The financial trend shows, again in a snapshot, how you are spending against the projected budget. A lot of times we'll see that these are not filled in or else not accurately filled in. Sometimes they may seem extraneous, but they are very helpful, and like I said, allow us to very quickly gauge progress against scope and budget. So they are very, very helpful for us. Along with those is the milestones and deliverables portion of the progress report. Again, this lists individual deliverables by task and status, and if you're looking at, next time you look at one of our reports, you'll see that both the project progress table and the milestones and deliverables section has A through G, and those would be linked to the tasks in your scope of work. So task A, if you completed it, would be 100%. Task B, if you're halfway through, would be 50%. And likewise in the milestones and deliverables. The A portion would be task A. You would provide a description. You would list when that task started, when it was planned to be completed, the revised completion date, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this helps us when we review reimbursement requests, and it helps us to more accurately track against the scope of work. That's why we like to see things broken down by tasks in both the project progress table as well as the milestones and deliverables section. And the next section is really important for us, and it's important for grantees to be forthcoming. The technical cost and schedule problems section, this is basically the grantee's opportunity to tell us where they're running into challenges. And I can tell you from experience that a lot of times grantees will sort of gloss over this section, but it's important for us to know exactly what's going on, not just the achievements, but also the problems, because we can help. We'll know, for example, if a grant is falling behind schedule, and this will also help explain discrepancies in invoice requirements or in invoices. For example, if invoices seem slow, then we'll be able to check this and see why. So it's really important that grantees be forthcoming. You're not going to be penalized if you're running into problems. We're the government. We're here to help. I just want to emphasize that you clearly explain what's happening. If there are any problems, if there aren't any problems, that's great. And the final field on the quarterly progress report is where the grantee describes work plan for the next period. And that helps us because when we receive the next quarterly progress report, we can compare the two and see how you did against what you were projecting to do. Common mistakes in the FRA quarterly progress reports, as I mentioned before, not enough detail. The more detail we have, the easier it is for us to do our job, the easier it is for us to review invoices, and the less back and forth we need with grantees to resolve questions. Again, no tasks listed. Like I said, the project progress table and the milestones and deliverables section are sort of key to go along with the tasks in the scope of work, and it helps us if grantees take advantage of that correlation and list tasks in accordance with the letters and progress. And then again, as I mentioned before, some grantees don't always use the project progress and cumulative financial trends. I want to encourage grantees to do that because, as I mentioned, they provide a brief snapshot of progress both against the scope of work and against the budget. The next report that's required of all of our grantees is the Federal Financial Report Standard Form 425. I'm sure everybody is very familiar with this one. As I mentioned, it's a fairly standard report used across many government agencies. Some agencies tailor their 425 for their particular programs. I believe FRA uses just the standard one. All grantees are required to submit this. Like the FRA progress report, it is due within 30 days after the end of each quarter. And again, submit to the grant manager and the administrative officer via email. Most grantees submit both the quarterly progress report and the 425 in the same email. That's great. Again, I just want to reemphasize that the grant number be in the subject line so we know where to file it easily. Fields 1 through 9 on the SF-425 are standard general information. I don't believe there are really too many issues come up here. Your DUNS number and your EIN, employee identification number. If you're new to reporting, both of those are on the cover sheet of the NGA. The recipient account number, I will leave that up to you. If you want to track your own internal account numbers, that's the field to use it. Report type, for FRA, they will all be quarterly until the final. So semi-annual and annual are also options in this field, but they would not be checked for most FRA grants. The basis of accounting field is just whatever accounting method you use, cash or accrual. It doesn't make any difference to us. The project period, field 8, is the start and end date for the project. And it's important that we keep track of this because once the current project end date ends, then FRA cannot accept any reimbursement requests for work done after that end date. We can accept reimbursement requests after the end date, provided they were for work done during the project period. But once the project period ends, we cannot reimburse for any work done afterwards. So it's important to keep track of this. And if you see that your project is getting close to the end date, then get in touch with your grant manager about extending the period of performance for the grant. Finally, the reporting period end date, again, whether you're talking first, second, third, or fourth quarter, that's the date you list, December 31st, March 31st, et cetera. Now I'm going to go through the individual lines in Section 10 of the 425, which is really the substantive part of the 425 report. 10A through 10C are used by FRA to track how you are dealing with our money. 10A is cash receipts, and that is where the grantee fills in how much money you have received from FRA through reimbursement requests. 10B is cash disbursements, which is how much you have handed out to or you have dispersed to your own contractors and consultants under the project. And C, cash on hand, that shows us how much either over or above the amount of cash that you have received from FRA is there. Generally, that will be a negative number for FRA grants because FRA only reimburses, except for a couple of rare exceptions. So we generally will not disperse funds without proof that they have already been spent. But it is important to us that this is filled out accurately because it gives us an idea of what type of reimbursement request to expect in the coming weeks or months. And we obviously like to see our money out and being spent and projects being completed. So if this gets too negative, then that will sort of raise an inquiry from FRA as to why a grantee is not submitting reimbursement requests. The next field is used by FRA to track overall spending in the grant. Total federal funds authorized is, you can pull that number right from the NGA, but it is basically the amount of money obligated for this particular project. Federal share of expenditures is the cumulative amount cumulative amount of federal funds that have been received. The federal share of unliquidated obligations is the amount of federal money still left to be spent. And then 10G is the total federal share, which should add up to the amount of the original obligation. If it doesn't, we got to contact your grant manager because that's an issue. 10H is unobligated balance of federal funds. You generally won't fill that out. There will be some occasions where money is available for a project that has not been obligated, but most times that will be zero. The next section, 10I through K, is recipient share or the match. It is only required when there is a match. And this takes on sort of new importance in the past couple of years because all of our grants now require proportional spending. So I believe it's the Section 7, I think, of the grant agreement lists how much FRA money is in the project and how much match is in the project. And if it's 80-20 or 90-10 or 50-50 or what have you, the proportion for most of our grants, I'd say 95% of our grants, can never exceed the proportion that's set out in that section of the grant agreement. So this is where we can make sure that the grantee is spending the match funds in accordance with that provision of the grant agreement. And if we see that get out of proportion, then we're going to have to contact the grantee, find out what the problem is, and may hold up any more reimbursements until that proportion is back to even. The fields themselves are pretty self-explanatory. 10I is total recipient share required, which is the total match. J is the amount of match that has been spent, and K is the remaining recipient share to be provided. The next group of fields, 10L through O, is program income. That generally won't apply to most FRA grants, since our grants are construction or planning, feasibility study, that type of thing. This would be for when a grant that the grantee used to generate some sort of money, like maybe an operating grant or something like that. It generally is not used for FRA projects. I have had questions about reuse of materials in construction projects, for example, like ties in rail replacement projects and track. That is generally part of the match and not part of program income. If you have questions about program income or you think it may be applicable to your project, again, contact your individual grant manager or send a message to the FRA grant email inbox. Same thing with indirect expenses. That does not usually apply to most FRA grants. If you have any questions about that or think that it might apply to your grants, again, contact your grant manager. Remarks are not required for FRA. We generally use the narrative portions of the progress report to cover anything that would be covered in the remarks section. But make sure you sign and date the report. And the date is the date that it is submitted to FRA, not necessarily the date that is the date that the grantee prepares the report. I want to point out two things. First of all the financial information on this report is cumulative, so make sure you keep track of it and add it up as you go. It is not for each individual quarter. And second, I just want to make sure that for those recipients out there who have a match, that the match is listed in I through K, because we've had some confusion over that. And this recent influx of grants or outflow of grants, I guess, that FRA's progress has done. So I just want to make sure to reemphasize to those grantees with matches that you fill out that section, because like I said, it is critical for FRA in tracking the proportional spending that's required under most of our grants now. I'm going to hand it over to Alice now. I'm going to take a little break, get a drink of water, and Alice is going to discuss the 1512 jobs report and the FRA final report.
Thank you, John. I'm Alice Alexander. I'm here to talk to you about 1512. I'm excited to talk to you about this because this is a very important reporting requirement. Mind you, this is a reporting requirement only for ARA recipients. So if you do not have ARA money, you can take a little bit of time and go get your glass of water. This data is the data from the 1512 will be used to estimate jobs. It's created. The jobs that are created and the status of the ARA funds. It is really important to complete this accurately and timely because these numbers are used in lots of reporting requirements that OMB uses. OMB takes these funds and uses, ARA takes these reports, especially the jobs creation, and uses them in other reports on the economy. So please make sure you accurately fill out the number of jobs created within that reporting quarter. It is very important that you meet the deadlines, and those deadlines, as John talked about, are the 10th day after the end of each calendar year. That will be April 10th, July 10th, October 10th, and January 10th. You must meet these deadlines, otherwise you will be in non-compliance. The key components of a 1512 report are report information, award recipient information, project award information, and project information. The first section, the reporting information, is basically your award number and the type of award that you have, either grant or cooperative agreement. Most ARA projects are cooperative agreements. The second section is the award recipient information. This includes your DUNS number, your account number, and most importantly, your congressional district, because this information is tracked for Congress. So make sure you have that one, especially in there correctly, along with your jobs number, because that number will be compiled and sent to be used for your congressman. The third section is the award information. This is detailed information on the award and any sub-awards or vendors. If you are to provide the amount of the award, the total number of sub-awards to individuals, and total number of payments to vendors. It also requests a description of your award. The next section is your project information. In this, you're supposed to enter the title of the project, quarterly activities, what has actually happened. This is a really important place to say what you've accomplished, what you're doing, and how well you're doing. That would also be discussed in your project status. You need to include your 50% complete, 100% complete, just like you do in the other progress reports. The two audiences are different. For the progress report that John talked about, that is for internal FRA. This information is for external. It's for O&B, and they pull all the reports from all the different agencies, pulls them together, and reports them out on one great big report. So there are two different audiences, and you need to report and understand that the audiences are different. So your project status, you really want to talk about what you've accomplished, how many jobs, how much of the construction is done. That's very important. For the subrecipients and vendor tabs, you need to provide detailed information on any contracts, subcontracts, or subawards, subgrants awarded by the grantee. Common mistakes that we have found when people are reporting, when we have to go back and review these, as some of you might know, we go back and forth to make sure the information that's reported in this is accurate. You have lots of times they're inexact project codes, incorrect project descriptions. Make sure you talk about what you've done, what your project's about, and they match. You need to make sure that you're consistent along the way. Your job information is too general. We need specific. What are your jobs that you're creating? Is it construction? Is it environmental? What exactly are these jobs that you have created? You need to make sure you put in the right award date and you have the right award amount. That's basic information that you can pull off of your NGA. Make sure you also pull off of your NGA the CFDA number. It's usually 20.319 or 20.932. Also, for all of ours, you need to make sure that the funding agency code or awarding agency code should be 6930. Another mistake that we often find is that your jobs and expenditures don't jive. Lots of jobs, no expenditures, lots of expenditures, or no jobs. Make sure at least for a ballpark that they match up. You don't want to be spending $1 million and have no jobs created. Doesn't look good. Or that you have 1,000 jobs created and you haven't spent any money. That doesn't look very good either. You will get questions if you have that kind of reporting in your 1512. And make sure the amount that is expended is updated every quarter, because usually you are spending money every quarter on these construction projects. Our last slide for 1512 provides an example of how to calculate jobs created and retained. Since this number is one of the key important factors in this report, we thought it was important that we went through and showed you how to calculate it. To calculate the full-time employee, you need to take the number of hours worked and funded by ARA during the reporting period and divide that by the hours in a full-time schedule. And that will equal the FTE, full-time equivalent. To calculate the hours in a full-time schedule, you take the number of hours worked in a week by a full-time employee, usually about 40 hours, and multiply that times the number of weeks in a quarter. And we use 13 weeks in a quarter. And that equals the hours in a full-time schedule. They have a good example there. You have a full-time employee who worked fully funded by recovery funds. Then you have a second employee whose full-time hours, he works full-time, but partially he worked on recovery items. And then you have a third employee who worked part-time hours but didn't work for anything under your recovery grant or cooperative agreement. So those hours are not included in your calculations. You total up the number of hours these people have worked, and then you divide by the number of full-time equivalents, and then you end up with 1.5. If you have any questions about this, your grant manager will be able to answer those questions for you. The last thing I'm delighted to talk to you about is the final performance report. This is basically an enhanced closeout report. It's required for all grantees and all cooperative agreements. It's really important. This is important to you and important to us. First of all, this is where you can toot your horn and where you can say all the wonderful accomplishments of how you got your project done and how you got it done on time and on budget. This is a great way to tell us how your project benefits and how the taxpayer's money was being used properly. Photos of the project before and after are great, as a picture paints 1,000 words. I'm going to go through the key components of this. First of all, you have to have your project title and grant number. Make sure they're accurate because we're going to be putting this in a file and we're going to be pulling them up for a future reference. A high-level summary of what your project's all about. Then the project narrative. This is where it's very, very important to take what you have in your statement of work and use all those tasks or all those categories that you have in your statement of work and your budget categories, which should be matching. Make sure you describe each single activity that you have in your statement of work in your grant agreement or your cooperative agreement, and describe each single thing, what you were supposed to do and what you actually accomplished and how you accomplished it. It's where you get to say how wonderful you completed your project. This is the bulk of your closeout report or your final performance report. The next section is your budget narrative, or what you could do is put in a simple table of what your budget was to be in your, according to your statement of work, then what your final budget ended up, and then your variance. And then talk about why your budget was different. You need to talk about the material variances and what happened through this project. This is to make sure that you cover what some of the problems might have been or how wonderfully you were under budget. Depends upon each project. They're going to have a different story here. And it also will help you describe if you have any, you were so efficient you were underspending, and why you're de-obligating some money if you have extra money left over. Finally, for your final performance report for ARA cooperative agreements only, you must submit all your required documentation by July 31st, 2017. This allows us enough time to review everything and to reimburse you no later than September 30th, 2017. That is the last time we possibly can reimburse you for ARA-funded projects. Please make note of this date, as it's very important, and this is only particular to ARA cooperative agreements. If you have any questions on how to complete a final performance report, talk to your grant manager or send it to the FRA grant mailbox. I'm going to turn it over to John so he can wrap it up.
Okay, Alice and I have kind of rattled on a little bit here. We're running out of time, so I'll just quickly run through these reminders on the wrap-up page. Reporting is a requirement of receiving federal funds and a critical component of federal grants management. Helps make sure projects are on track in terms of scope, schedule, and budget, and probably most importantly for you all, helps us to process reimbursements quickly. It is grantees' responsibility to review the NGA, identify which reports are required. You can refer to the FRA website for guidance on completing and submitting reports, and those applicable addresses are going to be on the next slide. Use your FRA staff and those resources that are available to assist you, your regional manager, your grant manager, and the FRA grants email inbox. Make sure grant numbers and titles are correct, and I'm glad this is here. This is true for everything. It's especially true for reimbursement requests, because if you have the incorrect grant number on a reimbursement request, it may get kicked back. Make sure you fill out all the required fields and reports and do not leave blank spaces. When submitting reports, as I mentioned before, please include the grant number and the title in the subject line of the email. That makes it much easier for us to distribute internally and file in all the applicable places. If you are unable to meet a deadline, please notify your grant manager as soon as possible. You can work out arrangements. The exception is the R1512 deadline. As Alice and I both have mentioned, the 1512 report goes to somebody other than FRA, and those deadlines are very, very strict. So please make sure that you submit your 1512 reports on time. Finally, I just want to go over the possible consequences of inaccurate or late reporting. Could deny or delay reimbursement requests. Could lead grantees to be subject to increased monitoring activities. It could affect your potential for future funding, and ultimately, grantees could be reported for noncompliance. Final slide is a list of the resources that are available to help grantees. These are all on our website. Our website has very extensive information for assisting grantees in understanding and filling out reports. We have templates that are available. We have instructions for completing those templates. Again, as we've mentioned numerous times, if you have individual questions about a grant or a project, please talk to your grant manager, your regional manager, or the FRA email inbox, which you can see on the bottom of the page, fra-grants@dot.gov. Inquiries will go into that inbox, and responses will be generated. One last thing before we take questions. The slides for this presentation will be posted on our website sometime in the next week or so. I assume it will be on the reporting page, but you might have to do a little searching to find it. If you can't find it, let us know, and we will direct you to the right place. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Like I said in the beginning, we would like to see questions that are general and would apply to all or a significant number of our grantees. Specific questions about individual projects or grants should be directed to your grant manager.